No cameras were allowed, no press release, no official statement, but somehow the world found out. For decades, the Temple Mount has been a mystery buried in stone and silence, a place where archaeologists couldn't dig, governments wouldn't interfere, and religious leaders warned, "Don't touch what's sacred." But all of that just changed. Something has been discovered beneath the Temple Mount that rewrites everything we thought we knew about one of the most sacred and most politically explosive pieces of land on Earth. This isn't speculation. It isn't conspiracy. What scientists found deep under the southern edge of the Temple Mount has been described by scholars as the most controversial archaeological revelation of this century. Before we go any further, make sure you're subscribed, because the deeper this story gets, the more doors it opens. If you're into real history, suppressed discoveries, or ancient secrets finally coming to light, this is where it all unfolds. Tap the like button so this truth isn't buried again. Because what's under the Temple Mount was never meant to be found. It all began with a routine geological survey. Quiet, low profile, non-invasive, using ground-penetrating radar and seismic scans, harmless tech on paper. But that scan returned something no one was prepared for. A rectangular void, carved directly into solid bedrock. Not a natural cave, not erosion. This was man-made. The geometry was too clean. The alignment was too perfect. The depth, nearly identical to descriptions from multiple religious texts, Jewish, Christian, and Islamic, all pointing to the same thing. A concealed chamber once described as the most sacred space in ancient Israel. And inside this void, that's where things get even stranger. A corridor, a sealed threshold, possible steps, and something artificial, possibly even inscribed, resting near the chamber's center. Authorities moved fast. The data was locked down. The team was told to pause, no media attention. But leaks started to trickle through the academic world. The location, the scan results, the implications, and the question that rocked scholars across faiths. Had we just located the lost inner court of the first temple? To understand the weight of that, you need to understand where this all happened. Because the Temple Mount isn't just any archaeological site, it's the most sensitive, most politically charged, most spiritually revered 35 acres on the planet. It's where the first and second Jewish temples once stood. It's where Muslims believe the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven. It's the place many Christians believe will one day witness prophecy unfold. But here's the catch. No one is allowed to dig beneath it. Not the Israeli government, not international archaeologists, not even religious authorities. Excavation is banned. Why? Because Jewish law forbids anyone from stepping into the Holy of Holies, the inner sanctum, without being ritually pure. But since no one knows exactly where it once stood, every square foot is sacred by default. On the other side, the Islamic Waqf, which controls the Temple Mount's religious administration, prohibits any non-Muslim excavation whatsoever, and even neutral scientists, they're kept out to avoid diplomatic disaster. So for over a century, the Temple Mount has been effectively sealed shut, its secrets buried under centuries of politics, theology, and fear. Until now. Because technology doesn't need permission. It doesn't carry spades or disturb holy ground. It listens, it scans, it sees through stone. And what it just saw beneath the surface has sent shockwaves across the academic world. But here's the thing. This might not even be the first clue. Because the real evidence? It wasn't found underground. It was thrown away. Between 1996 and 1999, during construction work on the Temple Mount, something suspicious happened. More than 400 truckloads of soil were quietly removed from the sacred compound and dumped into the Kidron Valley. No permits, no oversight, no records, just gone. But that dirt wasn't ordinary dirt. It had settled on the Temple Mount for centuries, maybe millennia. And it wasn't just soil, it was holding secrets. In 2004, a group of Israeli archaeologists launched an emergency operation called the Temple Mount Sifting Project. Their goal? To comb through every grain of that discarded earth and see what had been lost. What they found was staggering. Over 500,000 artifacts, pottery shards dating back to the 10th century BCE, the time of King Solomon, arrowheads from the Babylonian invasion, coins from the reigns of Herod and Pontius Pilate, bone tools, jewelry, architectural fragments, oil lamps, even ivory objects and glass beads with ceremonial carvings. And while many of these items could have been dismissed as generic relics from Jerusalem's vast history, there was a pattern of sacred use, items tied to ritual, objects matching biblical descriptions of temple worship, artifacts not of domestic life, but of priestly function. This wasn't random debris, it was an archive, an unintentional time capsule tossed away in a rush. And for the first time, physical, datable objects were telling the same story as the scriptures, that the Temple Mount was more than a religious tradition. It was real, it was active, and its forgotten relics are now resurfacing. But that was only the beginning, because tucked inside a handful of soil, dumped, discarded, and left for dead, something almost went unnoticed. A misshapen lump of hardened clay, no larger than a thumbnail, faded, fragile. But once it passed through the mesh of the sifting screen, it revealed something priceless. Stamped into its surface were letters in Paleo-Hebrew. Not random markings, not decoration, a name, a title, a bloodline. Galyahu, son of Immer. A name pulled straight from the book of Jeremiah, an elite priestly family responsible for temple duties during the final decades before the Babylonian destruction. Then came another seal, and another. Pasha, Shelemiah. All figures from scripture, all tied to temple administration. Each seal once attached to parchment or papyrus, rolled, tied with string, and sealed by men whose job was to protect the sanctity of the Temple Mount. These were not merchant contracts or household letters. These were records of the priesthood, clues that a bureaucratic center, perhaps even a scribe's archive, once operated atop the Temple Mount itself, and these weren't fakes or misplaced relics. Stratigraphy and sediment analysis confirmed their age, the soil composition matching first temple geological layers, untouched by later mixing or contamination. What began as a dirt dump was quickly becoming a direct line into Jerusalem's sacred core. And then from that same soil, something even more intimate surfaced. Not administrative, but deeply ritual. A bronze incense shovel. Still intact, its bowl blackened with a residue that no one expected to survive. When tested, the residue revealed a chemical profile matching ancient aromatic compounds, labdanum, myrrh, frankincense, the exact blend used in temple offerings as described in Levitical law. This was no ordinary tool. It was sacred hardware, used not by civilians, but by priests, standing inches from the holiest rituals of their time. Nearby, oil lamps were found, charred from repeated use, some with wicks still fossilized in the spouts. And among the debris, an object no one could explain at first glance, an ivory comb, delicately carved but snapped in two. Under closer inspection, faint letters emerged, etched into the side in early Canaanite script. A full sentence, the oldest known in the region. A wish for hygiene and purity, likely part of a ceremonial cleansing routine. This was a priest's comb. Symbolic, sacred, used to purify the beard before ritual, its destruction perhaps part of the act itself. Then came the bones. Animal remains sorted and packed unusually tight in the sediment. No scorch marks, no cooking signs, but deep consistent cuts made with iron tools, ritual dismemberment. The patterns didn't match domestic waste. They mirrored the sacrificial butchery described in the book of Leviticus. Organs separated, fat portions removed, clean breaks along joints. Not random violence, ceremonial order. Every item, every pattern, every context pointed to one conclusion. This wasn't just worship. It was a system, a daily cycle of purified rituals, precise roles, repeated acts governed by law, carried out by an elite class who documented, prepared, and performed. And then, not far from this swirling cloud of ancient ritual, the ground opened again, not with a bang, but with the scrape of a trowel near the western wall tunnels. What archaeologists had believed to be an ordinary retaining wall turned out to be something older, something stranger. Beneath modern stonework, a buried staircase emerged, carved from limestone, worn smooth by centuries of vanished footsteps. The steps were broad, deep, and descended at a gentle angle, too purposeful to be accidental. And they didn't just drop into a void. They led directly into a chamber sealed for generations. Inside, Christian iconography. Crosses etched into stone, altar niches carved into walls, traces of incense still clinging to the ceiling soot. It had once served as a chapel, likely from the Byzantine era. But the real revelation lay not in the symbols on the wall, but in what supported them. Because beneath the Christian layer, hidden just below the surface, the chamber's foundation was built from ashlar blocks, massive, unmortared, and perfectly fitted. And the moment archaeologists saw the tooling on the stone, they knew. This wasn't Byzantine, it wasn't Roman, it was Solomonic. The chisel marks, the stone margins, the smooth bosses, it all matched the unique masonry found only in the oldest Israelite structures. Identical to what had been uncovered at the ancient city of Megiddo, where Solomon's Gate once stood. And these stones weren't repurposed leftovers. They were a foundation, part of something bigger, something now long gone. The measurements aligned with architectural descriptions in 1 Kings. The construction matched the style and scale of known First Temple infrastructure. Even the pollen trapped in the lime pointed to species native to the 10th century BCE. And if this was just the edge, what else lay deeper beneath the mount? With each step down that staircase, archaeologists weren't just entering another era, they were peering into a sacred timeline. One where each layer of faith had been built on top of the last, one where memory had turned into stone, and stone had hidden the memory for millennia. But that memory was now unraveling, and it was only going to get stranger. They dug past stone that empires had laid. Byzantine chapels, Roman columns, Herodian steps, layer upon layer of history, compressed into silence. But when the dust finally cleared, what they found underneath wasn't just older, it was ancient. Resting quietly below 2 millennia of sacred architecture, a massive lower foundation revealed itself, untouched, undisturbed, and absolutely out of place in any post-exilic context. The blocks were enormous, finely dressed, and stacked with surgical precision. No mortar, no modern reinforcement, just raw stone, perfectly balanced. The tooling was unmistakable, wide margins with smooth faces and recessed bosses, a style used only during one narrow window in Israel's construction history. This was Solomonic masonry, the same seen in the gates of Haza, Megiddo, and Giza. And here it was, under the Temple Mount. Material samples trapped in cracks between the stones were sent for analysis: carbon flecks, crushed lime, ancient pollen. The results came back clear. The foundation dated between 950 and 900 BCE, matching the biblical timeline for King Solomon's reign. And more than that, the orientation of the foundation matched something specific. 1 Kings chapter 6. Dimensions. Courtyard layout, the southern alignment. Everything fit the ancient blueprint. It wasn't just a foundation, it was a footprint. One that may have supported the outer court of the original First Temple, the sacred zone where sacrifices were offered, songs were sung, and thousands gathered during the high festivals. And all of it, every last stone, had been resting in silence beneath the surface for more than 2,500 years. But the stones were only the beginning, because for the first time, technology was beginning to peel back the rest. Using ground-penetrating radar, originally deployed for structural mapping and disaster planning, scientists scanned the southern edge of the mount. The scans pierced through layers of compacted rock, ancient fill, and man-made retaining walls. What they returned changed the mission entirely. Beneath the limestone were rectilinear voids, right angles, symmetrical patterns, curved arches, no fault lines, no sinkholes. These weren't natural formations, they were chambers. Some collapsed, some sealed, some echoing faint signatures of staircases leading into darkness. And then came the maps, British Mandate-era blueprints from 1910, long dismissed by modern institutions, marked the area with a faded annotation, possible vaulted chamber, right on top of the largest hollow space revealed by the radar. The dimensions of this chamber, a near match for the ancient descriptions of the Holy of Holies, the innermost sanctuary, where, tradition claims, the Ark of the Covenant once rested. The GPR images were stunning, smooth chamber outlines, consistent dimensions, and adjoining tunnels sealed at multiple junctions. Even pressure anomalies suggested interior air pockets, meaning the chamber hadn't collapsed or filled with sediment. It was intact. One cavity lay directly beneath where historical reconstructions placed the first temple's inner court. Coincidence was no longer an option. Every signal pointed to the same conclusion, that underneath the mount is a hidden system of man-made ritual chambers, built with impossible precision long before modern records began. But there was more than stone and space down there. There was water. As scanning continued near the southern excavation zones, something extraordinary appeared. A buried hydraulic network, plastered cisterns, narrow ducts, inclined channels lined with crushed limestone. At first it seemed like a medieval irrigation system, but the carbon dating told a different story. Lime residue and plaster samples placed the construction firmly in the 9th century BCE during the reign of King Hezekiah. And the design? It was far from primitive. Engineered to prevent stagnation, the system included flow regulators, pressure balancing ducts, and directional locks. Some of the channels curved back on themselves in a loop, an ancient method of regulating flow without modern valves. The layout mirrored descriptions found in 2 Chronicles 29. Water brought in for priestly purification, cleansing the temple courts, preparing sacred tools and sacrifices. Every basin and conduit aligned perfectly with the temple rituals described in the Old Testament. But here's what stunned engineers reviewing the data. The design was deliberate, not improvised. Flow rates had been calculated. Drainage was separated from intake. Even overflow routes led to secondary chambers, likely used to contain or dispose of ritually impure water. It was the opposite of chaotic. This wasn't just ancient plumbing, it was sacred hydraulics. An entire water purification machine, hidden below the mount, operating with a level of precision that seemed centuries ahead of its time. And it raised another question. If the water system was this advanced, what else had they mastered? What else lies hidden in the darkness, humming silently beneath one of the most disputed, restricted, and sacred pieces of land on the planet? Because stone doesn't lie, water doesn't lie. And the radar, it's just beginning to speak. It wasn't just belief, it was engineering. Beneath centuries of rubble and reverence, the Temple Mount's sacred infrastructure began revealing something radical. This wasn't a place of random rituals or makeshift altars. It was a precision-calibrated system, carefully designed to channel water, fire, blood, and incense through a daily cycle of divine operations. The tunnels, those same 9th century channels once dismissed as drainage, were now seen for what they truly were: ritual arteries. Water didn't just arrive at the temple, it was directed, filtered, and delivered to specific basins, precisely aligned with sacrifice zones detailed in Levitical law. Ash residue in one basin, layered in fine grey sediment, showed repeated cleansing, likely of knives, bowls, or even sacrificial animals themselves. Each zone was functionally isolated. Maps reconstructed from digital scans revealed something chillingly advanced: temple zoning. There were designated pathways, dedicated chambers, flow-separated pools, each assigned to a different class of priest, a different stage of preparation, a different type of offering. The layout was surgical, as if the temple wasn't just a holy site, but a machine. One that ran on faith, yes, but also on flow rates, gravity, and architectural foresight far ahead of its time. And then came the silence. A sealed chamber, hidden beneath a limestone vault, undisturbed, unmarked, unopened, for nearly 2,700 years. The breach wasn't dramatic, no trumpets, no grand entrance, just a careful chisel, a slow lift, and a flashlight beam that caught something the world hadn't seen since the first temple stood. A round stone basin, half buried in ash, charred incense flakes scattered around it like black petals, and the glow of oil lamps, still intact, lined against the chamber walls. But it was the inscription that stopped everything. Etched in ancient Paleo-Hebrew, shallow but perfectly preserved, were 8 haunting words. He who dwells here, his spirit never leaves. At first glance, poetic. But to the scholars, it was far more than that, because nearly identical phrases appear in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in fragments describing the most sacred space of all, the Holy of Holies, the place where the ark once rested, where only the high priest could enter once a year on Yom Kippur, his body tethered with rope in case he did not survive the encounter. Suddenly the basin wasn't just a basin, it was a marker. And the ash, possibly the residue of the Ketoret, the sacred incense blend, burned before the ark. For the first time in modern history, there was physical, datable, textual evidence, not of a temple myth, but of the Holy of Holies itself. And that's when the storm began. News of the discovery didn't hit headlines. It never reached press conferences or government websites. It leaked, whispered through academic channels, cited in coded footnotes, and slipped into classified archaeology reports. But the moment it reached Jerusalem's religious authorities, everything changed. Orthodox Jewish leaders called it spiritually catastrophic, not because it wasn't real, but because it was. If this was truly the Holy of Holies, then even the act of unsealing it, without the highest level of ritual purity, could have consequences not just symbolic, but metaphysical. They demanded a halt. They warned of sacrilege. They called for the site to be resealed, and for the world to forget what had just been found. Christian groups responded with the opposite. Some hailed the inscription as confirmation of prophecy, a direct sign that the end times calendar had just started ticking. Evangelical leaders across the globe began calling for open access, full disclosure, and immediate verification of the chamber's contents. Islamic authorities, already wary of any digging beneath the Temple Mount, condemned the leak as politically destabilizing, accusing foreign archaeologists of using science to violate the sanctity of Haram al-Sharif. And through it all, the Israeli government remained silent. No official statements, no press briefings, only a quiet request to pause all excavation until further notice. But the scans didn't stop. With physical access restricted, researchers proposed a solution: muon imaging, a technique used to see inside pyramids, volcanoes, and nuclear reactors without disturbing a single stone. Muon particles, generated naturally by cosmic rays, can be tracked as they pass through rock, revealing voids, cavities, even hidden doors. Proposals were drafted, funding quietly allocated. Scans are now being prepared, not to dig deeper, but to see deeper. And what those scans might reveal could dwarf everything discovered so far. Because now, the world isn't asking if there are more chambers. It's asking, how many, how deep, and how long have they been waiting? In less than a year, the Temple Mount has gone from being the most untouchable site in archaeology to a portal into an untouched spiritual engine that's been dormant for over 2 millennia. What began as a silent scan now threatens to shake 3 of the world's largest faiths. The echoes of prophecy are louder than ever. And the question isn't what we've found, it's what happens next. Because we're no longer circling the Temple Mount from a distance. We're not reading scripture or debating theology. We are inside it, inside the tunnels, inside the chambers, inside the silence that held its breath for 3,000 years. Until now. If this left you speechless, hit like. If you want to witness what gets uncovered next, subscribe. Because the Temple Mount is no longer hiding.